Hey guys, before we begin, I want to let you know that later in this video I am going to be making a major announcement, so you will definitely want to stick around for that. I will give you a little hint, it involves brand new content and it is pretty good, so you do not want to miss it. Okay, as for today's video, we are actually going to try something completely new. I am going to tell you 3 stories about real people who had something totally unexpected and insane happen to them. Think of it like a stranger than fiction type of thing that not only changed their lives, but also changed the lives of millions of other people too. Now, these stories are kind of a slight departure from what is normal on this channel, and we know that. So please let us know in the comments what you think about this series. If you enjoy it, we will definitely do more of them. But before we get into those stories, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place because that is all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that is of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and replace all of their very expensive, nice kitchen knives and their fancy butcher block with cheap plastic butter knives. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you do not miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let us get right into today's stories. One late night in the summer of 1974, a 30-year-old man named Fred stood inside of a loud, crowded casino in Las Vegas, feeling incredibly nervous. He knew what he was about to do was a horrible idea. In fact, he did not even know if he had the courage to try it. Fred grabbed a huge wad of cash out of his pocket, and as he looked down at it, he thought about the exact reason he was standing there. Fred had actually flown to Las Vegas on a complete whim after a disastrous meeting with a group of investors. To understand how Fred got to this point, we have to look at his past. Fred had served as a pilot in the Vietnam War, and during his time in the military, he had watched how the armed forces shipped supplies and equipment all over the world. He realized that the military used a hub-and-spoke system to get packages to their destinations quickly and efficiently. When Fred returned to civilian life, he looked at how commercial shipping worked in America. At the time, if you wanted to send a package across the country, it was incredibly slow and expensive. Packages were put on regular passenger airplanes, which meant they had to make multiple stops and often got lost or delayed. Fred decided he could do it better. He envisioned a company that owned its own fleet of planes and used a massive central hub to sort and deliver packages overnight. And so, in 1971, Fred founded his company. He put everything he had into it, including his multi-million-dollar inheritance. But building an airline from scratch was incredibly expensive. Within 3 years, the company was hemorrhaging money. Fred had actually already lost over $13 million to this point. The price of jet fuel had skyrocketed, and the company was barely scraping by. Fred desperately needed a massive loan from a group of wealthy investors to keep the doors open, so he flew to a business meeting, hoping to secure the funding. But the investors looked at his financial records, shook their heads, and flatly said no. They told him that his track record was just not good enough, his company was losing too much money, and they were not going to throw any more money down what they saw as a sinking ship. This was an absolute crisis for Fred because right now, in all of his company bank accounts combined, he had a total of $5,000. At a minimum, he needed to pay his fuel bill for his fleet of planes, which was $24,000, and that bill was due in just a couple of days. If he did not pay the fuel bill, the fuel suppliers would refuse to fill up his planes, the aircraft would be grounded, and the entire business would come to a crashing halt. He did not have nearly enough money to cover it, and besides that massive fuel bill, he also did not have any money to make the upcoming payroll for his employees. Basically, Fred had run completely out of money, and if he did not find a way to find $19,000 more, he would have to file for bankruptcy, shut his business down, and lay off all of his hardworking employees. Fred really could not think of a worse fate. He totally believed in this company. This was his dream, his baby. He had sacrificed his personal fortune for it, but now it was on the very brink of collapse unless he got incredibly lucky. Instead of flying straight back to his company headquarters in Memphis, Fred made a wild, impulsive decision. He boarded a flight to Las Vegas. He figured that if his company was going to die anyway, he might as well take the last $5,000 and see if he could turn it into enough money to survive for another week. When Fred stepped off the plane in Las Vegas, the desert heat hit him, but inside the air-conditioned casino, he felt cold with fear. All around him in the casino, Fred could see gamblers hunched over slot machines, poker tables, and blackjack tables. Some people looked completely elated, like they were having the time of their lives, while many others looked like they were having the worst night of their lives and were on the verge of tears. Fred did not know if he would be celebrating or sobbing by the end of this night. All he knew was that he was completely out of options. He could either do nothing and just accept his fate that his business was doomed, or he could take what little cash he had left and put it on a game of chance. And so, after taking a deep, calming breath, Fred began walking over to a blackjack table because someone had told him that of all the games you could play in a Las Vegas casino, the game with the mathematically best odds for the player was blackjack. Fred chose a table with an open seat. He exchanged all of his cash for casino chips while he prayed that he was making the right choice, and then Fred began to play. For the first few hands, Fred was pretty cautious, only placing small conservative bets. He watched the dealer closely as the cards were slid across the green felt. To his relief, he won his first hand. Then he won his second hand. It began to build his confidence, and so he began placing larger and larger bets. Miraculously, he began winning those bets too. He was hitting 21s, the dealer was busting, and his stack of chips was starting to grow. In fact, it got to the point where he was winning so consistently that a crowd of complete strangers had formed behind his table just to watch Fred play. But Fred was not even aware of the crowd growing behind him. He was so intensely focused on every single card, every single hand. For him, this was not just a game. He was literally gambling with his life's work, his employees' livelihoods, and his entire future. Eventually, he got to a place where he had a literal mountain of chips sitting in front of him, and he was gambling massive sums of money all at once. Then, eventually, when he had this big mountain of chips in front of him, Fred decided this was it. He was going to double down and go completely all in on one final hand. He pushed all of his chips into the center of the table and waited. The dealer dealt the cards. Fred's heart was beating out of his chest as he looked at his hand. He had a strong hand, but the dealer still had to show their cards. The dealer flipped over their cards, and as soon as they did, the crowd around Fred, which he had not even noticed to this point, erupted in massive cheers because Fred had just won. When the dealer pushed all the chips back over to him and he got to count exactly how much money he had, he realized he had started with only $5,000, but now he had $27,000. He had gambled his last dollars and won. $27,000 was just enough to pay that $24,000 fuel bill and keep his company running a little bit longer, which was basically exactly what Fred had hoped for. Fred immediately left the casino, flew back to Memphis, and paid the fuel bill. The planes kept flying, and the packages kept moving. And then, during this extra time that Fred had basically won for himself, he was able to secure $11 million in new investor funding. The investors saw that Fred had kept the company alive against all odds, and they finally decided to take a chance on him. That money was enough to finally scale up this small business into the global giant that we all know it as today. Fred went from being a desperate guy betting his very last chips at a casino table to now being a multi-billionaire. Fred's full name is Fred Smith, and that little company that he scaled up on a gamble was FedEx. Before we move on, I have a major announcement. MRBALLEN Studios, the home of the strange, dark, and mysterious, today has officially launched another brand new show. It is called Late Nights with Nexo. It is totally free, it is a podcast, and it is hosted by none other than Nexo, who you might already know from YouTube. He has been around for many years, and he has got millions of subscribers on YouTube. He has got this incredible, deeply immersive storytelling style, so if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, I know you are absolutely going to love Late Nights with Nexo. The stories, the mysteries, and the kind of bone-chilling, crazy stuff he is going to cover on this podcast will be totally exclusive to the podcast, so you cannot get these stories on his YouTube channel. You can only get them on this MRBALLEN Studios production. It is called Late Nights with Nexo. It comes out every single Wednesday, and at the end of today's video, we are going to play you a sneak peek of the very first episode. But beyond that, after this video is over, you can just look up Late Nights with Nexo on any podcast platform you use, and you can listen today to the first 2 episodes because they are live right now. So again, if you are a fan of the content you already get on this channel, you are going to love Late Nights with Nexo. It is a free show out of MRBALLEN Studios every Wednesday. Enjoy. One evening in the late 1980s, a young man in his 20s named Norm walked into a house party in the Hollywood Hills, which is a very exclusive, wealthy, and pricey neighborhood in Los Angeles, California. In this massive house, which was filled to capacity with people, there were all these actors, writers, directors, models, and high-profile Hollywood-type people. Norm, who was this kind of scruffy guy with long, stringy hair and who had absolutely no experience in the entertainment industry, knew he did not fit in here at all. In fact, Norm never would have been at a party like this if not for what had happened to him just a few hours earlier. That afternoon, Norm had gotten into a terrible, heated fight with his boss at the motorcycle repair shop where he worked. Norm had always loved motorcycles. He loved the mechanical aspect of taking them apart and putting them back together. But he had always struggled with authority, and his boss was a very difficult man to work for. They had never really gotten along, but they managed to coexist for the most part, except on this particular day. A customer had brought in a bike, and Norm and his boss got into a massive argument about how the repair should be handled. The argument quickly escalated from a professional disagreement into a personal screaming match. His boss was yelling, Norm was yelling back, and finally, his boss told him to pack up his tools and get out. He was fired on the spot. And so, after getting fired, Norm left the shop feeling incredibly angry, frustrated, and defeated. He had no money, no job, and no idea how he was going to pay his rent. He just began aimlessly walking around the hot, sunny streets of Los Angeles, trying to cool off, until he wound up running into one of his good friends. His friend could see that Norm was in a terrible mood, and over the course of their conversation, Norm explained how his boss had just fired him and that he was not doing too good. His friend looked at him and said, "Hey, tonight there is going to be this big party up in the Hollywood Hills. Why don't you just come along with me?" Norm, who was feeling admittedly pretty down and frustrated, decided, "You know what the heck? I will go to this party because maybe it will help boost my spirits and distract me from my problems." And so, now here he was. Norm went and found his friend inside the crowded house party, and for a little while, the party was actually pretty great. Norm felt kind of uncomfortable and did not really know anybody, and it was definitely a bit awkward for him because he was surrounded by wealthy, successful people while he was just a broke mechanic. But he tried to make the best of it. He and his friend were drinking and chatting, and his friend was introducing him to some people, and it was all going well, except Norm just could not shake the deep anger he felt about getting fired. He kept thinking about how unfair his boss had been and how he was now completely unemployed. And so, to cope with this building anger, Norm began drinking really heavily, way more than anybody else at this party. Before long, Norm was completely plastered, totally drunk, but it would turn out that getting completely smashed did not calm Norm down at all. In fact, if anything, the alcohol only made him more blind with rage about what had happened to him at the shop. He felt like he needed to scream, like he needed to let everyone know how angry he was. And so, naturally, he decided he had to let it out. He departed from his friend and pushed his way through the dense crowd of people, making his way up to the second floor of the house. Up there was a balcony that overlooked the main living area where basically everybody in the house was gathered, talking and laughing. Norm, who was slurring his speech and was a total physical mess, leaned over the wooden railing and screamed out to the crowd of people below. He did not know a single person there, but he yelled at them to stop what they were doing and listen to him right now. Surprisingly, everyone actually did. The music was turned down, and they turned around and looked up at this random, scruffy guy with long hair on the balcony, wondering what was going on. Norm then began delivering this totally angry, chaotic rant that honestly did not even make any sense. He was incredibly drunk, but he was pouring his heart out, screaming about how mad he was, ranting about his boss, and talking about this horrible injustice that had been done to him. He went on, waving his arms and pouring out all of his raw emotions, and everybody down below was just standing there looking up at him, completely captivated. It was like watching a train wreck. They could not look away because he was so passionate and raw. Eventually, Norm finished up his big, rambling, humiliating speech, and he stepped back away from the railing, disappearing into the background. Everybody down below, who had been completely wrapped by his performance but now was kind of like, okay, whatever that was, went right back to partying. Norm just stood up there on the second floor, catching his breath and taking in the scene, when suddenly he felt a gentle tap on his shoulder. He turned around and saw there was a person standing there whom he did not recognize at all. This person looked at Norm and asked if he had ever considered acting in a play. It would turn out that this person was a successful Hollywood producer, and they were currently putting on a play in Los Angeles. They really liked Norm's unique look, the whole scruffy, rugged vibe he had going on. But even more than that, as they watched him deliver that totally angry, drunken rant on the balcony, they realized he managed to get a room full of distracted partygoers to stop everything and listen to him. It was completely obvious that he had a massive amount of natural charisma, and he could command an entire audience even when they had no idea what he was talking about. And so, ultimately, this producer literally offered Norm an acting job right then and there. Norm, who really did not have any aspirations to be an actor but now desperately needed a job because he had just been fired that afternoon, agreed. He said, "Okay, I will act in your play." And so Norm would go on to act in this play, and he would do an absolutely incredible job despite the fact that he was not a trained actor. He literally was just a guy who got fired, got drunk at a party, and randomly got recognized by a producer. But regardless of his lack of experience, he acted in this play, and he was such a natural and did such a good job that he gets noticed by other prominent Hollywood producers and casting directors. Before long, he lands his starring role in the mega-hit TV show The Walking Dead. Norm's full name is Norman Reedus. One evening in the late winter of 1973, a 23-year-old mother named Tabby put her 8-month-old son and her 2-year-old daughter down for their evening naps inside of their double-wide trailer, which was parked in a small town in New England. Once her kids finally fell asleep, Tabby walked over and looked at the clock on the wall. She was waiting for her husband to get home from his day job as a high school teacher, and he was running incredibly late. Tabby wondered what could possibly be holding up her husband, and she certainly hoped that he was okay, but she could not just call the high school to ask how he was doing because they did not even own a landline phone. They literally did not have enough money to afford a phone line in their trailer. In fact, they basically only had enough money to barely make ends meet each month. Tabby and her husband actually had big dreams of becoming professional writers, but they had found over the past few years that breaking into the publishing world at this time in America was nearly impossible. They had met in college, where they both fell in love with literature and writing. They had married young and started a family, believing that their passion for writing would eventually pay off. But the reality was incredibly harsh. They had gotten a few short stories published here and there in small magazines, but for the most part, the only thing their writing had gotten them was a mountain of rejection letters. And so, as a result of this financial struggle, both of them had taken on multiple day jobs to supplement the income that was not being generated from their writing. Tabby stayed home with the kids during the day, and then in the evening she would work long shifts at a local Dunkin' Donuts. Her husband, in addition to teaching high school English during the day, also worked late nights at a commercial laundromat, washing heavy hotel sheets, industrial aprons, and tablecloths. He was constantly exhausted, working over 60 hours a week just to earn enough to pay for rent, heating oil, and basic groceries. Now, Tabby still held on to hope that maybe one day she or her husband could break through and be a professional writer and have that be their primary source of income. But her husband, who also had the exact same dream, was over time becoming increasingly more pessimistic about his opportunities to ever make a living as a writer. He sort of felt like this goal was truly impossible, that they would struggle like this forever and he would never become a successful writer. He had a nail on his bedroom wall where he would impale every single rejection slip he received, and over the years, the weight of the slips had grown so heavy that the nail actually bent under the pressure. Tabby walked to the tiny laundry room in the very back of their double-wide trailer to switch their wet clothes from the washing machine to the dryer. This small room actually doubled as her husband's writing office. He had squeezed a tiny desk in there, right next to the noisy washing machine, where he would sit late at night after his laundromat shifts and type away on his old typewriter. As soon as Tabby walked back there, she saw his makeshift desk was a total, chaotic mess. All around his typewriter, which sat right in the middle of the small table, were all these empty beer cans, food wrappers, and crumpled up rejection letters from various magazines and publications. The small trash can next to the table on the ground was completely overflowing with crumpled up pieces of paper. Feeling very annoyed by this mess, Tabby reached down to tie up the trash bag so she could take it outside, but as she went to do that, she happened to glance at one of these crumpled up pieces of paper sitting near the top of the trash. She decided to smooth it out a little bit, and she skimmed a couple of sentences that were typed on the page. As soon as she did, she stopped, because there was something really interesting about this writing. Now, she knew her husband had written whatever was on this page, but generally speaking, her husband always shared with her absolutely everything he wrote, and she would read it and give him feedback. But there was something about this text that she knew she had never read before. This was completely different. Clearly he wrote it, but she had not seen this project before, and so she was incredibly curious. She pulled the paper entirely out of the trash can, smoothed it out on the table, and actually began reading what turned out to be the beginning of a failed manuscript that her husband had thrown away. The page described a scene of a young, socially awkward high school girl named Carrie White who was being cruelly bullied by her classmates in the school locker room. As Tabby read the words, she was struck by how raw, powerful, and deeply emotional the scene was. She could feel the girl's pain and humiliation through the writing. It dawned on Tabby that her husband had been working on this in secret, which made her wonder why he had hidden it from her and why such a brilliant piece of writing was sitting in the trash. Just then, Tabby heard the front door of the trailer open, and she heard her husband come inside, looking exhausted and defeated. And so, Tabby took the crumpled pages she had pulled from the trash and walked out of the laundry room to meet him. She held them up to her husband and asked him what this was and why he had not shown it to her. To Tabby's surprise, her husband, when he realized what she was holding, just looked totally embarrassed and ashamed, like he wished she had never found it. She looked at him and said, "No, this is actually so good. What is going on here?" And her husband sighed and told her, "Look, I started writing this thing, I did not really know what it was going to become, but I quickly realized that I do not know enough about the subject matter." He explained that, because the story was about a teenage girl and focused on the dynamics of high school female relationships and bullying, he felt completely out of his depth. He did not know how teenage girls thought, spoke, or interacted, and he felt like he was just writing a bad caricature. He also said that even if he did finish it, it was just too weird, too dark, and no publisher would ever want to buy a book about a bullied girl with telekinetic powers. And so, in a fit of frustration and self-doubt, he had thrown the pages in the trash. He went on to tell Tabby that he really understood at this point in his life that he was just a failed writer, and right now, what he really needed to do was give up writing altogether and just focus on his teaching and laundromat jobs to make money for the family, which was something they desperately needed. Tabby could see her husband was completely serious and totally defeated, and so she just held up the pieces of paper, looked him in the eyes, and told him that this was the one. This was the story that was going to help him break through. She told him that even if he did not know how teenage girls thought and acted, she did, and she would help him write those parts. She said that together they could make this a full-length novel and that he had to see it through because it was just too good to be thrown away in the trash. And so, at Tabby's insistence, that is exactly what her husband did. He would spend several months working closely with Tabby, who gave him invaluable advice on how girls behaved and talked in high school. He typed away late into the night, and by the spring of 1974, the novel was completely done. They sent the manuscript to several publishers, really having no idea how anybody was going to react to such a dark and unusual story. But they were both totally blown away when one of the major publishers they sent this thing to, Doubleday, came back and said they wanted to publish the book. A short time later, another publisher bought the paperback rights. The editor called the local drugstore where they left messages for the couple because they still did not have a phone. When the editor told them they were getting a $400,000 advance for the paperback rights, which in today's money is about $2.5 million, they could not believe it. It was a massive, life-changing book deal. The young couple was totally thrilled. With the money they got, they were finally able to move out of their double-wide trailer, and they were able to purchase a landline telephone of their own. But that was only the very beginning. Tabby's decision to pull that crumpled-up piece of paper out of the trash can and force her husband to turn it into a novel would prove to be a legendary choice, because her husband would go on to become arguably one of the most famous and successful writers in human history. That story that Tabby saved from the trash can would go on to become the iconic horror novel Carrie. Tabby's husband was none other than Stephen King. Now, let us transition to our final story for today, which is a haunting, real-life mystery that takes us deep into the frozen wilderness of Siberia in August of 1993. This is an incredible and terrifying story that began on a freezing cold river flowing past the towering Kamar-Dian mountain range. One afternoon, a group of tourists was kayaking down the river, enjoying the fresh mountain air and the rugged, untouched landscape. Out here, the only signs of human civilization were power lines running over the high peaks of the mountains, which were easy enough to ignore. But out of nowhere, something caught their eye, and the peaceful atmosphere of their trip instantly dissolved. There was someone standing on the far shore of the river, framed starkly against the dark green trees. It was a teenage girl, and she was waving her arms frantically, screaming at the top of her lungs for them to stop. From this distance, they could not quite make out her face, but her jacket was stained with dried blood. The kayakers did not hesitate. They steered to the shore, jumped into the freezing water, and rushed toward her. When they reached the girl, she collapsed into their arms, completely delirious and inconsolable. They could barely make out what she was saying through her heavy sobs. She kept repeating that she was scared and that she was all alone. The kayakers wondered why this young girl was out in the deep wilderness by herself, but what she said next answered their question and made their blood run completely cold. She looked at them and screamed that everyone else was dead. This girl's name was Valentina Utachenko, and she was only 17 years old. She was part of a hiking group of 7 people who had set out on what was supposed to be a standard, scenic mountain trek. But what happened to them on those slopes would become one of the most baffling and terrifying mysteries in modern history. To understand how Valentina ended up alone on that riverbank, we have to go back to the beginning of their journey. In the summer of 1993, a 41-year-old experienced hiking instructor named Lyudmila Korovina was organizing a trip. Lyudmila was known for being a tough, highly capable guide who loved the outdoors. She wanted to take a group of her best students from a tourist club on a challenging hike through the Kamar-Dian mountain range. This mountain range is located in southern Siberia, near the massive Lake Baikal. It is a place of breathtaking beauty, but it is also incredibly rugged and unpredictable. Lyudmila selected 6 young hikers for the trip, all of whom she had trained herself. There was Alexander, who was 23, Tatyana, who was 24, Denis, who was 19, Timur, who was 15, Victoria, who was 16, and finally, 17-year-old Valentina Udachenko. These teenagers and young adults were not beginners. They had been training for months, practicing their survival skills, learning how to navigate tough terrain, and building up their physical endurance. They were incredibly excited for this trip. For them, it was the ultimate summer adventure. And so, on August 2nd, 1993, the group arrived at the town of Marino, which sits at the base of the mountains. The weather when they started was absolutely beautiful. The sun was shining, the sky was clear, and the temperature was warm. They loaded up their heavy backpacks with food, tents, sleeping bags, and supplies, and they began their hike. The plan was to trek across the mountain range, climbing several peaks over the course of about a week. The first few days of the hike went perfectly. The group was making great time, moving steadily up the forest-covered slopes. They laughed, they sang songs around the campfire, and they took in the spectacular views. Lyudmila was incredibly proud of her students. They were working together as a cohesive team, helping each other carry heavy gear and navigate tricky trails. But on August 4th, as they neared the peak of Mount Tritrans, the weather began to turn. In Siberia, the weather can change in an instant, and that is exactly what happened here. The clear blue sky was suddenly replaced by heavy, dark clouds. The temperature plummeted, dropping close to freezing. Then, a massive storm hit. It started as a cold rain, but it quickly turned into heavy sleet and snow. The wind picked up, howling across the exposed mountainside and reducing visibility to almost nothing. Lyudmila knew they needed to find shelter, but they were high up on an exposed slope with very little cover. Instead of trying to push forward to the forest line, which was some distance away, Lyudmila made the decision to set up camp right there on the barren slope. They pitched their tents against the howling wind and crawled inside to escape the freezing wet snow. They spent a miserable night huddled in their sleeping bags, listening to the storm rage outside, praying that the weather would clear up by the morning. The next morning, August 5th, the storm had not stopped. The temperature was still freezing, and the wind was vicious, tearing at the fabric of their tents. Lyudmila decided they could not stay on the exposed slope any longer. They needed to pack up their camp and head down into the tree line where they would be protected from the wind. The hikers, shivering and wet, packed up their damp tents and loaded their heavy gear. But as they started to walk, the first sign of disaster struck Alexander, the 23-year-old, was leading the way. Suddenly, without warning, he let out a horrific, blood-curdling scream. He dropped his walking stick, clutched his head, and fell to his knees. The other hikers stopped in their tracks, watching in horror. Alexander began to roll around on the wet ground, groaning in agony. Blood began to pour from his nose, his ears, and his eyes. He was foaming at the mouth, his body shaking violently. Lyudmila, the experienced leader, rushed to his side. She cradled his head and tried to calm him down, yelling for the others to help. She ordered them to get a medical kit and warm blankets. But before anyone could move, Alexander went completely limp. His eyes rolled back into his head and he stopped breathing. He had died in a matter of seconds. Lyudmila was devastated. She held Alexander's lifeless body, sobbing and screaming in grief. But then, as the rest of the group watched in sheer terror, Lyudmila suddenly stopped crying. She clutched her own throat, gasping for air as if she was suffocating. She looked up at her students with wide, terrified eyes. She began to foam at the mouth and blood started streaming from her nose and ears. She fell backward onto the snow, her body convulsing violently. Within moments, she too was dead. At this point, the remaining teenagers were completely panicking. Their leader and their strongest hiker were dead on the ground, bleeding from their faces. The wind was howling and the cold was biting. Dennis, the 19-year-old, tried to take control. He yelled at the others that they needed to run, that they had to get down the mountain right now. He grabbed his pack and urged everyone to follow him. But as he turned to run, he suddenly collapsed onto the ground. He began to seize, foam bubbling from his lips, blood leaking from his eyes. He died right there in front of them. Next was Tatiana. She screamed in terror, running blindly through the sleet, but she only made it a few yards before she tripped and fell. She clutched her head, crying out that her brain felt like it was on fire before she went silent and still. Victoria and Timur, the youngest members of the group, were frozen with fear. They started tearing at their own clothes, ripping off their jackets and shirts despite the freezing temperatures. This was a common symptom of extreme hypothermia, but they were also bleeding from their noses and eyes. They collapsed into the snow, their bodies shaking before going completely still. Valentina Utachenko was the only one left standing. She was 17 years old, surrounded by the bleeding, lifeless bodies of her friends and her mentor in the middle of a freezing Siberian blizzard. She knew that if she stayed there, she would die next. Her heart was pounding and she was terrified, but her survival instincts kicked in. She grabbed her sleeping bag, a small tent, and whatever food she could quickly pull from a nearby backpack. She did not look back. She ran down the mountain as fast as she could, pushing through the blinding snow and wind, desperate to reach the tree line. And so, Valentina began a desperate journey of survival. She walked for days through the dense, unforgiving Siberian forest. She had to cross freezing, fast-moving rivers, navigate thick brush, and sleep in her damp sleeping bag while listening to the terrifying sounds of wild animals in the dark. She was starving, exhausted, and deeply traumatized by the horrific scenes she had witnessed on the mountain. She spent 4 agonizing days wandering through the wilderness, completely lost, until she finally stumbled upon the river. She saw the power lines overhead and knew that civilization must be nearby. She waited by the riverbank, praying for help, until she finally saw the kayakers. The kayakers took Valentina in, giving her dry clothes and hot food as they paddled down the river to the nearest town. They contacted the local police, and soon Valentina was in a hospital, being treated for exposure and shock. But the police were deeply skeptical of her story. It sounded like something out of a horror movie. 6 healthy, experienced hikers dying in a matter of minutes, bleeding from their eyes and ears. It did not make any sense. The initial theory of the investigators was that the hikers must have succumbed to extreme hypothermia. They believed that the storm had disoriented the group and that they had simply frozen to death. The bizarre behavior Valentina described, like tearing off clothes and screaming, was attributed to the late stages of hypothermia, which can cause confusion, delirium, and a false sensation of burning hot body temperature. But the problem was, hypothermia does not cause people to suddenly bleed from their eyes, ears, and noses in a matter of seconds. It does not cause people to foam at the mouth instantly. Investigators knew there had to be something else going on. Because of the severe weather and the remote location, it took several weeks for a search and recovery team to actually reach the site on the mountain. When they finally arrived, they found a grim scene. The bodies of the 6 hikers were scattered across the slope, exactly where Valentina had said they fell. The summer heat and wet weather had caused the bodies to decompose significantly, which made the forensic investigation incredibly difficult. The bodies were transported to a morgue for autopsies. The forensic pathologists were looking for any clue that could explain these sudden, violent deaths. When the autopsy reports came back, they raised more questions than answers. The official cause of death for all 6 hikers was ruled as hypothermia. The pathologists noted that there were signs of bruising and fluid in the lungs, but they claimed there was no definitive evidence of poison or chemical exposure. But the public and many independent investigators did not buy the official story. Hypothermia simply could not explain the rapid onset of the symptoms, nor could it explain why the hikers died so quickly, one after another. It was almost as if they had been exposed to some kind of highly toxic substance. This led to a series of wild and terrifying theories about what really happened on that mountain. One of the most prominent theories was that the hikers had accidentally stumbled into a secret military testing zone. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union had conducted numerous secret tests of chemical and biological weapons in the remote wilderness of Siberia. Some people believed that a cloud of toxic gas, perhaps a nerve agent like Novichok, had drifted over the mountain from a nearby military facility. Nerve agents can cause rapid convulsions, foaming at the mouth, loss of bodily functions, and death within minutes, which matched Valentina's description perfectly. Another theory was that the hikers had been poisoned by contaminated water. The area around Lake Baikal has some unique ecological features, and some scientists wondered if a rare, highly toxic strain of blue-green algae had bloomed in the mountain water. If the hikers had boiled water from a contaminated stream to make tea or soup, they could have ingested a lethal dose of microcystins or other cyanotoxins. However, Valentina had also drank the water and eaten the same food, yet she remained completely unaffected. A third, highly unusual theory involved a phenomenon known as infrasound. Infrasound is a low-frequency sound wave that is below the limit of human hearing. It can be generated by powerful winds passing over specific mountain formations, creating what is known as the Kármán vortex street. Some researchers believe that high levels of infrasound can cause intense panic, dizziness, nausea, and even physical damage to internal organs, including blood vessels, which could lead to internal bleeding. According to this theory, the wind howling over the exposed slope of Mount Trytrans created a massive pocket of infrasound that drove the hikers mad and physically destroyed their bodies. While Valentina, who was slightly further down or had a different physical makeup, survived. Despite all these theories, no definitive evidence was ever found to prove any of them. The Russian government closed the case, officially ruling the deaths as an unfortunate accident caused by severe weather and hypothermia. But the mystery has never truly been solved, and it remains a haunting topic of debate among investigators and survival experts. Fast forward to today, and the Kármán mountain tragedy is often compared to the famous Dyatlov Pass incident of 1959, where another group of Russian hikers died under mysterious circumstances in the Ural Mountains. In both cases, highly experienced outdoor enthusiasts met a sudden, violent, and unexplained end in the frozen wilderness, leaving behind only a single survivor to tell a story that seems almost too terrifying to be true. Valentina Utachenko eventually recovered from her physical injuries, but the psychological scars of that day would stay with her forever. She chose to live a quiet, private life, rarely speaking to the media about the horror she witnessed on that mountain. The families of the victims were left to grieve without ever knowing what killed their loved ones on that fateful August morning. The Kármán Mountains still stand, beautiful and silent, keeping their deadly secrets locked away in the snow. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Imagine watching your friends suddenly scream, bleed from their eyes, ears, and noses, and drop dead one by one in seconds. In 1993, an experienced hiking instructor and 6 fit students trekked into the Siberian wilderness. Caught in a freezing blizzard, disaster struck without warning. The lead hiker collapsed in agony, bleeding heavily from his face and foaming at the mouth before dying instantly. As the instructor tried to save him, she suffered the exact same horrific fate. Within minutes, 4 more collapsed and died in pure terror. Only 17-year-old Valentina survived to tell a story so terrifying the police didn't believe her. The official cause? Hypothermia. But freezing temperatures don't make you bleed from your eyes in seconds. What truly killed them? Nerve gas or something worse. Check the full video link in the comments. Tab 1 on the afternoon of August 2nd, 1998, a 48-year-old man named Mike Turner stopped for a moment on the side of a steep mountain. Mike was an imposing figure, standing at an impressive 6 feet 6 inches tall. He was strong, broad-shouldered, and had spent most of his life loving the great outdoors. But out here in the wild, even a man of his size felt incredibly small. Mike took his water bottle out of his backpack, unscrewed the plastic cap, and took a long, slow sip. He was standing in a small cluster of green pine trees on the side of this mountain, about 11,000 feet up in the air. This was inside of an area in Wyoming called the Fitzpatrick Wilderness. Now, if you have never heard of the Fitzpatrick Wilderness, it is easily one of the most visually striking and beautiful places in the entire world. It looks like all of the extremes of nature kind of collided together in this one place. On one hand, you have these massive, jagged, 13,000-foot-tall, snow-covered mountain peaks. You have actual glaciers sitting up there in the cold air. But then, right below them, right at the base of these huge mountains, are all these lush green fields full of tall grass and bright wildflowers. There are animals running around, and little streams, and crystal-clear lakes. It is absolutely picturesque. In fact, some of the pictures of this area look fake because they are just so ridiculous. But the real reason the Fitzpatrick Wilderness was known as this unbelievably beautiful place was because it went completely untouched by people. And the reason it went untouched was because it was so incredibly hard to get to. Basically, the only people who ever set foot in this very surreal landscape were highly experienced outdoors people like Mike Turner. It took a lot of know-how just to get to this area, let alone survive out there, because this is a very, very rugged place. But Mike Turner was not content just going to the Fitzpatrick Wilderness and staying on the safe paths. He really wanted to experience the true, untouched nature of this area. And so, what he was doing while he was out there was hiking entirely off-trail. He was in this totally remote place, walking around in an area that was not even marked on a map. Now, to anybody who has not done any compass and map navigating out in the wild, this might seem totally reckless. And to a degree, it sort of is. But it is also something that some people just have an innate knack for. Some people have a special skill to understand where they are in relation to terrain features, and if you combine that with proper training and experience, these guys get really good at just being able to navigate with a map and compass. Mike was one of those people who was an excellent navigator. Walking off trail like this in such a remote place was actually sort of routine for him. But Mike was not some full-time professional adventurer. This was just something he did that was a deep passion for him. His actual job was that he was a reverend at a Christian church in Idaho. He had been doing that for 10 years, and Mike absolutely loved being a reverend. He loved his congregation and his wife Diane and his 3 kids, who were 2 daughters and a son. They were all super involved in the church. It was a great life, but at the same time, being a reverend was a lot of work. It came with a lot of responsibility and a lot of daily stress. He spent long hours preparing sermons, organizing community events, counseling families in crisis, and managing the day-to-day operations of the church. Over the years, the way that Mike had found to cope with that growing stress was to go out hiking. He actually found it sort of ironic that when he was out in nature hiking, he felt much closer to God than when he was inside of his own church preaching. He looked at the natural world as this grand, beautiful gift from God. And when you are standing in the middle of the Fitzpatrick Wilderness, looking at this unbelievable terrain, it really does look like something divine. And so with that as our context, on this particular day that Mike had stopped to sip his water, this was actually the 4th day of a pre-planned 9-day solo hike. Mike had been planning this trip out for over a year. He had spent hours sitting at his kitchen table, studying topological maps, looking at elevation lines, and marking coordinate by coordinate on his physical maps. Even though Mike was a very skilled hiker and survivalist, he knew that doing any sort of long solo hike came with a whole bunch of serious risks. The biggest risk, of course, is that if you get into trouble when you are out on a solo hike, you are completely alone. There is nobody there to help you, so you better have a really good plan for what you are going to do if something goes wrong. And Mike had come up with what he thought was a great plan. He had spent that whole year mapping out this off-trail path he was going to take over these 9 days. It was a 60-mile trip through the wilderness, and he drew out basically exactly where he expected to go on a paper map. He gave that map with all the different coordinates and exactly where he would be on each day to his wife Diane, who also happened to be a very enthusiastic hiker. He told her that on the 9th day of the trip she was going to meet him at a specific spot at the end of the 60-mile. The meeting place was at the start of a trail called the Big Sandy Trail. He told her that he would meet her there at exactly noon on that 9th day, and then she could take him home. However, that plan had changed on that 4th day as Mike was sipping his water on the mountainside. And only Mike knew it, because he had absolutely no way to communicate back to his friends and family. Cell phones back then in 1998 were very primitive, and there was certainly no cell service out in the middle of this deep wilderness, so he could not just call somebody to let them know he was changing his plans. Basically, if he deviated from his plan, he was the only living soul who would know. And then, the reason why Mike decided to alter his course on the fourth day of this 9-day trip actually made a lot of sense. Even though Mike was technically solo hiking, he was not actually completely alone. With him was the beloved family dog named Andy. Andy was a very good-natured, energetic black lab mix who absolutely loved going hiking with Mike. Whenever Mike grabbed his backpack, Andy would start jumping around and wagging his tail, ready for an adventure. Over the course of the previous day, and then into this fourth day, Mike and Andy had been up at a very high elevation, walking at about 13,000 feet. Up there, they had to cross some icy, snowy parts of the mountain. Because they were walking on this jagged, hard ice, Andy's paws were getting really raw and sensitive. On that fourth day, Mike had noticed that Andy was whimpering and struggling to keep up with him. This was very unusual because normally Andy was super energetic, running all around and chasing after sticks or sniffing the trail, but now the poor dog was limping, keeping his head down, and obviously in pain. Mike stopped and knelt down on the trail to examine Andy's paws. When he lifted one of the dog's front paws, he saw that the rough ice and rocks had worn the skin down to the point where it was raw and bleeding. Mike knew that the course he was supposed to take for the next few days was going to take them even higher into the mountains, where there would be even more ice and rugged rocks. He looked at his loyal dog and realized that Andy simply could not keep up. He was not going to be able to do it, and it would be cruel to force him to keep walking on those painful paws. And so, Mike made a decision. He decided to alter his course and side-skirt the mountains to avoid the high-altitude ice. Even though this new path was definitely going to take him a little bit longer, he figured it would still eventually bring him to the same final destination. It would still lead him to that same pickup spot at the Big Sandy Trailhead where his wife and his family would be waiting for him. But Mike understood the gravity of this decision. By deviating from his route, not only would his family have absolutely no idea where he was, but also this secondary route was going to take a lot longer than his original path. He knew he was not going to make it to the meeting spot at the time he had promised. He was not going to be there at noon on the 9th day. It was probably going to be the 10th day, or maybe even later. But Mike had planned for this kind of contingency. He was a smart survivalist, so he had brought extra food rations and extra fuel specifically in case he had to extend his journey. He felt totally confident that even though this was a big risk to take a path that nobody else knew he was on, he could handle it with no problems. He had the gear, he had the experience, and he had the confidence. And so, after Mike finished taking a sip of his water, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a collapsible bowl that was specifically for Andy. He poured some water from his bottle into the bowl and placed it gently on the ground. Andy slowly made his way over, limping slightly, and began lapping up the water. As the dog drank, Mike looked down and saw Andy's tail wagging happily. Mike felt a wave of relief. Seeing how much better his dog was already doing made him feel confident that this was definitely the right decision. Taking the secondary route to protect his dog's paws was absolutely the way to go. But as Mike waited for his dog to finish drinking, something unexpected happened. Andy suddenly stopped lapping the water. He lifted his head up high and his ears perked up. It was obvious he had sensed something out in the distance. And then, before Mike could even react or say a word, Andy just took off running. He bolted into the thick trees and disappeared. Now, Andy was a playful dog, and he would periodically run around on their hikes, but this was different. Remember, Mike is out in the middle of the deep backcountry. He has deviated from his path, and he needs to be absolutely sure of where he is. He cannot afford to make any mistakes out here, and he certainly cannot afford to lose his dog. If Andy went rogue and Mike had to go chasing after him, the chances of getting turned around or getting completely lost, or maybe even coming into contact with a large predator like a grizzly bear, were incredibly high. Mike knew he had to get his dog back immediately. He grabbed the water bowl, stuffed it quickly into his pack, and took off running into the trees after Andy. He was calling out the dog's name, his voice echoing through the silent forest. After running through the thick trees for a short distance, Mike emerged on the other side, and suddenly he was hit with this incredible view. He was looking down towards a beautiful, pristine mountain lake. But right in front of him, sloping down towards that lake, was a huge clearing on the side of the mountain. This clearing was filled with massive boulders. These were not just normal rocks. These were giant boulders, some of them the size of small cars, and they were everywhere. It looked like over thousands of years, as the mountain eroded, huge chunks of rock had broken off and rolled down into this clearing, which was at a steep slant down towards the lake. It filled the entire space to the point where you could not actually walk on solid ground. The only way to get across this clearing was to step on top of the boulders. And as Mike looked out over this massive field of rocks, he saw his dog. Andy was making his way down towards the lake, clearly drawn by the water. Mike tried calling for Andy one more time, yelling for him to stop and come back, but Andy was on his own program, totally focused on getting to that water. Realizing he had no other choice, Mike resigned himself to the situation. He climbed on top of the first large boulder, balanced himself, and began jumping from boulder to boulder, trying to catch up to his dog. At first, things were going fine. Mike was a big, strong man, and even with his heavy backpack on, he was making decent progress. He got about halfway across the boulder field, keeping his eyes on Andy, who was still heading down towards the lake. But then Mike reached one particularly large boulder. It looked solid, but when he jumped onto it, the rock was actually completely unstable. As soon as his feet hit the surface, the massive boulder began to wobble and tilt under his weight. Instinctively, Mike knew he was in trouble. He tried to quickly leap off the wobbly boulder onto another rock that was right nearby. But as he jumped, he did not get enough distance. He undershot the second boulder. Instead of landing cleanly on top of it, Mike's feet slipped and he hit the face of the second boulder, sliding down into the deep, narrow gap between the two rocks. Fortunately, the fall itself did not hurt him. He was standing on the ground in this small space, a bit shaken but uninjured. But before he could even take a breath and try to climb back up, the wobbly boulder behind him did not just stop moving. Because it was on a slant, the wobble had caused the massive rock to lose its balance entirely. It rolled forward, sliding down the slopes, and came to a sudden heavy stop right against the second boulder. The boulder that Mike had just failed to land on. Basically, this massive 800-pound rock had rolled forward and sandwiched Mike between itself and the other boulder. But critically, when this happened, it did not crush Mike. It did not break his bones or cause him any physical pain. And the reason for this was incredibly bizarre, almost like a cruel twist of fate. The wobbly boulder had a natural U-shaped cutout on its face. It was like a deep divot in the rock. And by pure coincidence, the second boulder in front of it also had a similar U-shaped cutout on its face. When these two massive rocks collided and pressed together, Mike happened to be standing in the exact spot where those two cutouts met. The two curved pieces of stone wrapped perfectly around his ankles, acting exactly like a pair of heavy granite shackles. They pinned his legs together at the ankles, locking them in a tight space that was just big enough to hold them, but too small for him to pull his feet up and out. He was completely anchored to the ground. He could stand up, he could move his upper body, but his feet were locked in place. He was completely trapped. Mike instantly knew that this was an incredibly serious situation. He was stuck in the middle of a massive boulder field, miles away from any trail, with an 800-pound rock holding him down. He was completely by himself, except for his dog Andy, who obviously could not help him move a giant boulder. Mike did not panic right away. He immediately went into survival mode, trying to figure out a way to free himself. He figured if he could just move one of the boulders even a tiny fraction of an inch, it would be enough to release his ankles. He struggled out of his heavy backpack, letting it drop nearby. One by one, he pulled out his gear, he grabbed his metal camera tripod, thinking he could use it as a pry bar. He jammed the metal legs into the gap between the rocks and threw his entire weight against it, trying to lever the boulders apart. But the tripod just bent and twisted under the pressure. He tried using his metal stove, his metal water bottle, and any other hard object he had, trying desperately to find some leverage. He pushed and shoved with all of his strength, his muscles straining, his hands getting scraped and bloody against the rough granite. But the 800-pound boulders did not budge even a millimeter. After 2 hours of exhausting, frantic effort, the harsh reality finally began to sink in. Mike realized that he was absolutely not going to be able to free himself on his own. The boulders were just too heavy, and he was wedged in too tightly. The only way he was ever going to get out of this place alive was if someone came and rescued him. But the problem was, nobody knew where he was. Mike sat down as best as he could, wedged in the gap, and pulled out his blue journal. He had brought this along to write down his thoughts during his spiritual journey, but now it became a daily record of his fight for survival. He wrote down exactly how he had gotten trapped, so that if anyone found his body or his gear, they would know his story. He wrote about chasing Andy, the unstable boulder, and the heavy rocks that now held him captive. Despite the terror of his situation, Mike's first entry was filled with faith. He wrote that he was in God's hands and that he trusted God would help him through this. Once he finished writing, he turned his attention to setting up a survival camp in the tiny space he had. He wrapped his bright blue sleeping bag around himself to stay warm, and he pulled his heavy tent flap over his head to shield himself from the freezing wind. He saw that there were still a few patches of snow on the rocks within his reach, so he used his small stove to melt the snow into drinking water. That first night was pure torture. The temperature at 11,000 feet dropped to near freezing, and Mike lay there shivering, completely alone in the dark wilderness, listening to the wind and praying for rescue. The next morning, on the second day, Mike wrote in his journal again. This time, his writing showed his growing fears. He was terrified that the pressure on his ankles was cutting off his circulation, and that he might lose his legs. He also realized he was running out of water. He had only 2 quarts left, and the snow around him was melting fast in the hot sun. The most agonizing part was that he was sitting only 30 feet away from a beautiful, clear lake. He tried to tie a rope to his water bottle and throw it into the lake, but his throw was too short and the bottle got stuck in some rocks on the shore. He could not pull it back, and he could not walk over to free it. His only water bottle was gone. By the end of the second day, Mike was starting to realize just how desperate his situation was. He even joked in his journal about what his own urine would taste like if he mixed it with a Crystal Light packet, a dark attempt to cope with the reality of dying of thirst. On the third day, Mike experienced a strange burst of optimism. He wrote that he felt incredibly close to God and that this experience was a powerful spiritual event. He seemed convinced that he would be rescued, and he promised to be a better husband, father, and reverend once he got home. But as the days dragged on and no rescue came, that hope turned into deep despair. By the fifth day, Mike was suffering terribly from exposure, sunburn, and dehydration. He began to express anger and confusion in his journal, asking why God had abandoned him and if he was being punished. He felt a crushing, agonizing sense of loneliness. And so, things got even worse. Mike wrote that he had completely lost all feeling in his left leg. He knew his body was shutting down. In his journal, he wrote that he was so lonely, more than he had ever imagined. It is hard to picture the mental torture of sitting there in the silent mountains, slowly dying, knowing your family has no idea where you are. Around the sixth day, Mike accidentally dropped his journal into a deep crack between the rocks where he could not reach it. But he was determined to leave a message for his family. He began writing in the margins of his pocket Bible and on the paper instruction manual for his stove. His handwriting became incredibly shaky and hard to read as his body grew weaker. He wrote about his deep regret for changing his route, knowing that if he had stuck to his original plan, the searchers would have found him days ago. But by the ninth day, as he entered the final stages of dehydration, Mike seemed to find a sense of peace. He stopped fighting and accepted his fate. He wrote beautiful, heartbreaking messages to his wife Diane and his 3 kids, telling them how much he loved them and wondering about their futures. He prayed for peace and wrote that he was ready to die. His final entry was almost entirely illegible, just faint, scribbled lines on the page. But at the very end, he managed to write, "Love, Dad." Then, Mike did one last, thoughtful thing. He knew that after he died, his body would decompose, and his gold wedding band might slip off his finger and get lost in the rocks. He wanted Diane to have it. So, with his last remaining strength, he took off the ring and placed it carefully on a flat rock next to him. Then, he lay back and closed his eyes. Meanwhile, completely unaware of the tragedy, Mike's family was waiting for him. On the afternoon of August 8th, which was the 9th day of Mike's planned trip, Diane Turner, her 3 children, and some family friends drove to the Big Sandy trailhead. This was the meeting spot Mike had marked on the map. They arrived early, excited to welcome him home. But noon came and went, and there was no sign of Mike. Diane tried not to worry. She knew 60 miles off trail was a long way, and it was normal to be delayed. They waited all day and camped out at the trailhead overnight. The next day, August 9th, was the critical deadline. Mike had told Diane that if he was still not there by 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the 9th, she must assume something had gone wrong and called the police. Diane sat by the trail all day watching her watch. When 4 o'clock passed and Mike was still not there, Diane hesitated. She knew calling in a search party was a massive, expensive operation, and she kept hoping Mike would walk out of the woods at any moment. She decided to wait one more night. But on the morning of August 10th, there was still no sign of him. Diane knew she could not wait any longer. She drove to the nearest ranger station and reported Mike missing. The authorities immediately launched a massive search. Over the next 2 weeks, helicopters with thermal imaging cameras flew over the mountains, searchers on horseback rode through the valleys, and hundreds of volunteers combed the 60-mile route Mike had drawn on his map. But they found absolutely nothing. They did not know that Mike had changed his route and was trapped miles away, completely outside of the search area. The helicopters could not see him because his blue sleeping bag blended into the shadows of the boulders. After 2 weeks of searching with 0 clues, the authorities had to call off the search. The family was devastated, forced to go home to Idaho with no answers. Fast forward to 5 days after the search ended. On August 28th, a couple of backpackers were hiking through a remote section of the Fitzpatrick Wilderness. They were about 17 miles away from where Mike had started his hike. They knew about the missing reverend, and as they stopped to take a break, they heard a faint whimpering sound. Out of the trees walked a black lab. It was Andy. The dog was in terrible shape. He was extremely emaciated, his ribs were showing, and his paws were raw and bleeding. The backpackers gently called to him, fed him some granola bars, and gave him water. They led Andy down the trail and contacted the authorities. Finding Andy alive brought a massive wave of hope to Mike's family. They thought that if Andy had survived for 28 days, Mike must be alive too. A second search was launched, and they used Andy as a guide dog, hoping he would lead them back to Mike. But Andy was still weak and disoriented, and they could not find the exact spot, and then a separate backpacker, who we will call Brian, was hiking through a totally different part of the wilderness. Brian was not part of the search, but he had seen the missing person flyers. He was hiking miles off trail when he reached a steep mountain slope about 11,000 feet up. He walked through a cluster of trees and emerged into a massive boulder field. As he stood there looking at the beautiful view of the lake, he noticed a man sitting on a rock far across the field with his back to him. The man was completely motionless. Brian called out, but there was no response. Feeling uneasy, Brian climbed onto the rocks and made his way over. When he got close, he gasped. The man was wedged tightly between two massive boulders. His legs were pinned at the ankles by two giant rocks that had rolled together. It was Mike Turner. He had been dead for some time. Brian saw the blue sleeping bag, the camera, and the gold wedding ring sitting on the flat rock. He found Mike's wallet and confirmed his identity. Because he was so deep in the backcountry, it took Brian 3 days of fast hiking to reach a ranger station and report the discovery. The recovery team flew a helicopter to the coordinates and finally freed Mike's body from the boulders. When they recovered his gear, they found the blue journal, the pocket Bible, and the stove manual. By reading his final writings, the authorities were able to reconstruct the entire heartbreaking timeline. They realized Mike had survived for 10 days in the rocks. The journal revealed his initial faith, his struggle, his anger, and his ultimate peace. The investigation also showed that when they were using Andy as a guide dog, Andy had indeed been leading the searchers in the exact direction of the boulder field. He was a loyal dog trying to save his owner, but they just did not have enough time. The impact of Mike's death on his family and congregation was devastating, but his final words provided a small amount of comfort, showing that he had died with a heart full of love and faith. And to make the story even more tragic, on the day Mike left for his hike, a delivery truck had arrived at his home in Idaho. It was a beautiful bouquet of flowers that Mike had secretly ordered to arrive after he left. Attached was a note to his wife Diane, telling her how much he loved her and how much he was looking forward to the moment he would walk out of the wilderness and see her waiting for him at the big sandy trailhead. At this point, we need to talk about how the family began to process this loss. The sheer weight of knowing that Mike had spent those 10 days waiting and writing was both a curse and a blessing. It was a curse because of the unimaginable pain he had gone through, but it was a blessing because they knew his final thoughts. They knew he had not died in sudden terror, but had slowly transitioned into a place of profound peace. Diane took the journal and held it close. She read the entries to her 3 children, and together they cried, but they also found comfort in knowing that Mike's love for them was the last thing on his mind before he closed his eyes. To make sure we understand the exact details of the rescue and recovery, the sheriff's office released a report explaining that the boulders Mike was trapped in were made of solid granite. Each of these rocks was estimated to weigh over 800 pounds, which made it absolutely impossible for a single human being to move them without heavy mechanical assistance. The U-shaped cutouts on the faces of the rocks were a natural geological formation caused by centuries of water erosion and freezing temperatures. It was a 1 in a million occurrence that Mike's ankles ended up perfectly aligned within these 2 matching divots. It was a tragic, freak accident that could not have been predicted by even the most experienced survivalists. And so, the search and rescue teams learned a valuable lesson from Mike's tragedy. They realized that when searching for missing hikers, they must look beyond the designated trails and even beyond the planned routes. Sometimes a hiker will make a logical decision to divert from their path, and those diversions must be taken into account during the search process. Today, search and rescue operations use highly advanced GPS tracking systems and satellite messengers, which has made it much easier to locate people who find themselves in trouble. If Mike had been hiking today, he would have had a satellite communicator that would have allowed him to send an emergency signal immediately, and he would have been rescued within hours. But back in 1998, he was completely at the mercy of the elements and his own strength. When the recovery team arrived at the boulder field with their helicopter, they knew it would not be an easy task to retrieve Mike's body. The helicopter could not land directly on the steep, rock-strewn slope, so the pilots had to hover nearby while a team of 5 highly trained sheriff's deputies and rescue workers descended onto the rocks. They carried heavy steel crowbars, thick nylon straps, and a specialized portable hydraulic spreader, which is a tool often used by firefighters to pry open crushed vehicles. The rescuers worked in silence, the only sound being the wind blowing across the clearing and the metallic clank of their tools against the hard granite. They carefully positioned the hydraulic spreader in the narrow gap between the 2 giant boulders, just above Mike's pinned ankles. As the operator pumped the handle, the hydraulic cylinder began to expand, applying thousands of pounds of pressure against the rocks. The granite let out a sharp, groaning sound, and slowly, the wobbly 800-pound boulder began to shift backward. It moved just a few inches, but it was enough to release the tight grip on Mike's ankles. The deputies gently lifted Mike's body out of the gap, wrapped him in a protective sheet, and prepared him for transport. They also took great care to collect every single piece of his gear, making sure not to leave anything behind that might contain clues or hold sentimental value for his family. They picked up the bent camera tripod, the small stove, the camera, and the water bottle that was still wedged in the shoreline rocks. And of course, they carefully retrieved the gold wedding band from the flat rock, placing it in a secure pouch. When the medical examiner eventually performed the autopsy, they confirmed the details that Mike had written in his final notes. The official cause of death was exposure and dehydration. The examiner noted that Mike's body was remarkably strong, and it was his incredible physical conditioning that allowed him to survive for 10 full days in such harsh conditions. But without water, the human body can only last so long. The examiner explained that as dehydration sets in, the blood volume decreases, causing the heart to work much harder to pump oxygen to the organs. This leads to extreme fatigue, muscle cramps, and eventually severe hallucinations. By day 5 or 6, Mike's mind would have started to play tricks on him. He wrote in his Bible about hearing the laughter of his children, believing they were playing just out of his sight behind the trees. He also wrote about hearing the sound of running water, which was a cruel trick of his mind as he stared at the lake he could not reach. The physical pain of his numb leg was accompanied by the mental anguish of these hallucinations, making his survival even more of a testament to his strength. Back in Idaho, Diane and the children were trying to adjust to a life without Mike. The return of Andy the dog was a source of great comfort, but also great sadness. In the weeks following the tragedy, Andy's paws slowly began to heal. The raw, bleeding skin closed up, and the black lab mix was eventually able to walk without a limp. But the family noticed a profound change in the dog's behavior. Andy was no longer the hyperactive, playful dog he used to be. He would spend hours sitting by the front door of the house, his ears perked up, listening for the sound of Mike's car pulling into the driveway. Whenever someone walked through the door, Andy would jump up with hope in his eyes, only to slowly lay back down when he realized it was not Mike. The family realized that Andy was grieving just as they were. He had been there when Mike got trapped, and he had spent days trying to find help, only to return to an empty house. Diane would sit on the floor next to Andy, wrapping her arms around his neck, and they would comfort each other in their shared loss. The note that had arrived with the bouquet of flowers on the day Mike left was eventually framed and placed on the mantel in the Turner home. The note was a beautiful reflection of Mike's love and his positive outlook on life. In the note, Mike had written that he was so grateful for Diane's support and that he knew his solo trips were hard on her. He wrote that he looked forward to these hikes because they allowed him to recharge his spiritual batteries, but he also wrote that the best part of any journey was coming home to her. He told her that he would be thinking of her every step of the 60 miles, and that he would be counting down the days until they were reunited at the Big Sandy Trailhead. The flowers eventually withered, but the note remained a constant reminder of the deep, unbreakable bond they shared. The search and rescue community in Wyoming also paid tribute to Mike. They created a special training program named in his honor, focusing on off-trail navigation and survival techniques for solo hikers. The rangers at the Fitzpatrick Wilderness often share Mike's story with visitors, using it as a powerful cautionary tale about the importance of safety and the unpredictability of the mountains. They remind hikers that even the most experienced outdoors people can find themselves at the mercy of a freak accident, and that having a reliable way to communicate with the outside world is absolutely essential. The community in Idaho held a large memorial service for Mike at his church. Hundreds of people attended, and they shared stories of his kindness, his wisdom, and his love for the outdoors. Diane and the kids stood at the front of the church, holding the bouquet of flowers that had arrived after Mike left. They knew that even though Mike was gone, his spirit would always be with them in the beautiful mountains he loved so much. And every year on the anniversary of his death, Diane and her children make a trip to the Fitzpatrick Wilderness to look at the massive peaks and remember the brave, loving man who touched so many lives. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Short-A hiker vanished in the Wyoming wilderness, but the strangest clue came 28 days later. Mike Turner, a 48-year-old reverend, was on a solo mountain trip with his dog Andy when he suddenly changed routes to protect the dog's bleeding paws. Then Andy ran toward a lake, and Mike followed. In a field of giant boulders, one rock shifted and trapped Mike's ankles like stone handcuffs. Search teams looked everywhere, except the path he secretly took. The only suspect was the wilderness itself. Twist, Andy survived and tried leading rescuers back. But Mike's journal revealed the heartbreaking truth. Watch the full story on our channel.